because got it. I really want to think kind of like where does family fit in this whole situation? And I think that one of the things that I want to motivate. Oops, why is it not putting? Okay, there. So let me start by showing this figure, and I think it can motivate and put in context many of the issues that we'll be talking today. So this figure shows the number of people that arrived recently over time from the United States to Mexico by place of birth and age. So you'll see from 1990 to 2020, the kind of like the number of, well, the flows from the US to Mexico. And the first thing to note is that this flow includes both Mexican-born and US-born persons arriving from the United States. It also shows a relative constant share of US-born recent migrants who are under age 18. So this light blue that you can see over time. And so, as you might expect, returnees are adults, but the US-born immigrants in Mexico are children, okay? And this is not necessarily new, but you also can see that there's a peak in 2010 that has been explained by the impacts of the 2008 Great Recession, the increase of deportations and immigration enforcement. But something that is unclear from this data is how many of them arrived to Mexico because they were deported or because one of their parents was deported, okay? And we know that migrants return for many different reasons, for family reunification, for health conditions, for missing their family, for economic trouble. But it is unclear, as it is here, how many were deported. Now, we do know that as this US-born population in Mexico increased during this period, that actually what we saw was that there was an increase of settlement because there was actually an increase of share that was not recent, okay? So, I mean, this graph shows kind of like the recent flows, but at the same time, you see that the US-born population kind of like stayed in Mexico. And so the gray bars in the figure show the number of US-born children counted in the Mexican censuses and the population counts. The data for 2020 is not shown in this figure, but it's actually still over 500,000, okay? So the fact that the number of US-born children remain constant in 500,000 in part is due to the fact that people age out of childhood, but but other children arrive, okay? Now, this number of 500,000 US-born children in Mexico is similar to the number of Mexican-born children in the US under DACA currently. And I will argue throughout that although there's a lot of attention to this population under DACA, there is not enough attention to the US-born children in Mexico. And so again, like kind of like the idea is, or the question that is behind is what caused the population of these US citizen children living in Mexico to double in size within this period, especially from 2000 to 2010. And what I'm going to focus today is in the role of deportation, okay? And I was thinking a lot of what to present today, and I will be focusing actually on the results of this recent article that was published at PDR at the end of last year. And I've been doing this research with Erin Hamilton from UC Davis and Paula Langer, a PhD candidate also at UC Davis. And what we really show in the paper is what we estimate the number and characteristics of the children who were born in the US and migrated to Mexico to accompany a deported parent, right? And this is called de facto deportation. And just to motivate a little bit further the idea of de facto deportation, I'm going to talk about the story of Leti, okay? And so we interviewed her in Mexico City, in Coatepec in 2019. as a part of a research project that we are conducting interviews in Mexico City, in the metropolitan area of Mexico City. And we're actually writing a co-authored book with Erin, but also with Nicole Denier, an assistant professor at the University of Alberta. And so the book is under review right now. So hopefully I can go next time to Berkeley to talk about the book. But the idea is that, I mean, Letty met her husband, Alonso, when he was in Mexico City on a trip home. Alonso arrived to the United States in the early 1980s as a young person that was actually fleeing a violent situation in his family home. And he arrived without knowing anyone in the United States. He qualified for IRCA in 96. He obtained a green card. And so he was able to go back and forth. And it's actually in one of those trips that he met Letty, and he convinced Letty to come with him. And she migrated to the US in the 2000s, and he was already a legal permanent resident. And he could have sponsored Letty for a visa to the US, but they didn't consider this when she migrated. She actually just entered without inspection and lived without documents. And she married Alonso, she went to the US, but she never thought that she was going to work to the US. She really wanted to be with her husband, okay? And so actually, during the 5 years that she was in the United States, she never worked. Letty was instead a wife and a mother during her time in the US, and they had 2 children that were born in the US, and in many ways, they were a mixed status family, right? Alonso was a legal permanent resident. The 2 children were US citizens, and Letty was undocumented. And so at some point, they decided that they wanted to rectify this situation, and they began the process of applying to a visa for Letty, but this was not possible. He had been convicted of domestic violence from a different union, and he served more than 10 years in a prison in California before he had partnered with Letty. And so what's interesting is that in 1996, after IRA passed, this prior conviction actually was retroactively transformed into a deportable offense. And so even if the offense was not deportable at the time he committed it, it became deportable after 96. And it was also after IRA that it was impossible for a judge to consider Alonso's children, the well-being of these children, or any other circumstances in issuing a deportation order against him. So in applying for a visa for Letty, Alonso brought his prior record to the attention of the immigration officials. He was advised to leave the US to avoid arrest and immigrant detention. And actually in 2005, they all decided to move to Mexico to actually avoid this deportation order. And so in doing so, Letty and her children were de facto deported. Okay, and we argue that they were deported even if he did not have this deportation procedure. Because they migrated back to Mexico in the case of Letty, but also they immigrated in the case of these children, so they could stay together. And in their minds, this was the only option to actually stay together. Okay. Now, Letty's story is not unique. During the fieldwork, we actually interviewed other people who migrated to accompany a deported person, either a child, a mother, a father, and other family members. And there are actually many books that describe this experience as well. But again, we still don't know how many children are de facto deported, okay? And how many are similar to Letty's children. So just to put some figures into context, this is the annual number of deportations from the US going back from 1900 all the way to 2008. And we see that there was this peak kind of like in the 1990s, and then again in 2008, that reached about 400,000. As you might also know, Obama was the deporter-in-chief. And actually, you can see in this second graph, the monthly deportations from 2004 through 2020, just prior to the pandemic. And you can see that the peak that was reached in 2028 was actually sustained throughout the Obama administration. It declined later, and actually I mean, Trump's administration's deportations never returned to the Obama era levels, okay? Now, what we know is that from administrative data is that the large majority are actually Mexican nationals, right? About 70% are born in Mexico. Another fact that we know through administrative data is that a large number of deported people claim having a US-born child. And for at least a decade, the US Congress required DHS to report the number of deported people who actually claimed a US-born child. And these reports are available online from 2015 onward. Okay, it's possible to get access to some other years through journalist accounts or through data access through FOIA. But what is, I mean, this is kind of like how the report looks. And all we get is the total number of people who claim a US-born child and the method of deportation, right? And it's, I mean, we know that between 2014 and 2018, there was about 200,000 people deported who claimed a US-born child. But again, these numbers are not specific to Mexico. They do not give account of the number of children, right? And they don't give us a number of how many of these children actually accompany their parents to Mexico and stay in Mexico, right? We just know that this is the number of people that were deported and have a child. So kind of like the first research question of this paper was, first of all, how many US-born children living in Mexico were de facto deported by the US government? And we limited this for some reasons I'll explain to this period, 2014 and 2018. We were also interested in understanding what share of US-born children who emigrated did so because of apparent deportation, but we also wanted to understand what share of the children of Mexican immigrants in the US whose parents is deported actually emigrate, okay? Now, recent scholarship has studied the well-being of the US-born children in Mexico. They have focused on education, access to rights, to identity documents, to, I mean, changes in identity, to access to healthcare. And almost every study speculates that deportation was involved in the migration and the hardships that faced these US-born children. But none of them are able to differentiate among US-born children in Mexico by reason of migration, right? And this has been very, very interesting as well in other discussions on to what extent deportation is the main driver. So I don't know if some of you might be familiar with Joanna Drevis deportation pyramid that suggests that the harms of deportation policy on children vary by the family's response to deportation. So you can think that when someone is deported, there are different options, right? One of the options is to remain separate. Other options is to migrate together, right? But other options is to actually reunite in the United States after deportation. Now, in this pyramid that conceptualizes the harms of deportation, the most harmful consequences are on the top, and this affects the fewest individuals. And the more insidious consequences are at the bottom, affecting the largest number of children. And so, as I said, in the top, you have family separation. Then you have family, de facto deportation. And actually, the more frequent harms occur among the children who are threatened by, but do not necessarily experience parent deportation. And you can think that this is actually something that is very prevalent among the children of undocumented parents, or even parents with a legal permanent resident status that might be eligible for deportation. And so the idea is that kind of like there are no good options for reorganizing family lives when someone faces the deportation of a parent. So as I said, first you can remain separated, dissolute the family. This is kind of like at the top of Drevis pyramid. But then there's also this idea of de facto deportation that actually allows to avoid family separation for the parent. Another option would be to re-enter the United States. But as we know, this actually subjects to felony charges if caught, right? And there are some studies that actually show their intentions to go back to the United States after being deported, and there are different estimates, and this actually, there's other work by Erin that actually finds that 74% of the Mexican deported parents who left the children or a spouse actually intend to return, where this is much larger to the 45% compared to those who actually do not have children behind, okay? And we know that there's a lot of family separation that occurs, right? Now, when we talk about deportation, and this was the term that was coined by Canstrom, is that basically the idea is that the US government didn't order the children to be removed from the United States, but in light of these other options of keeping separate or re-entering, then this other option arises. And this might be the least bad option for the family to remain together, right? Now, Saya's book on this topic actually described the immigration enforcement system as creating exiles and orphans. And in the case of exiles, he writes that the citizen child forfeits the fundamental citizen right to residency in the United States in order to maintain his or her human right to parental companionship, right? So there's always this kind of like two, oops, there you go. Now, Luis Sayas also makes a very important point about the differences between migration that is not forced and forced migration. And we can think that de facto deportation is a form of forced migration. And one of the things he wrote is that the loss of country and the results that accompany it are not necessarily specific to migration between countries, but to the manner in which the migration occurred. So children who experience cultural changes by family choice do not suffer the trauma of deportation and may not suffer a lower standard of living. And in such situations, moving from the US to Mexico could be beneficial. And so in a way, I want you to see that he sets up something of a research hypothesis, right? And this is that if we were to compare children who return due to a family deportation, well, to a deportation of a family member, or children that return for other reasons, that somehow we might see greater average deprivation among those who were de facto deported, okay, as this result of forced migration. Whereas, and for other things, we would also expect that the children who migrate following a deportation will do so under different circumstances when the mother or the father is deported, okay? Now, we were also interested then, oops, this moved, in how de facto deported US-born children compared to US-born children that are migrated for other reasons in different indicators, okay? Trying to understand if there's actually this precarity thanks to deportation or attributed partially to deportation. We were also interested in kind of like gender and parental partnership, partnership status, with this idea that actually Sayas suggests about why gender is important. And we know that men are the large majority of people who are deported, right? This has been described by Golas Bosha, Honda Sotelo as a racialized gender removal regime. And Joanna Drevi actually calls this the deportation of fathers as creating suddenly single mothers, right? So there are reasons to expect that there will be differences, especially because we think that Mexican mothers are more likely to live with and care for and migrate with children. We might think that this might select on mothers, right? And we might also think that the ability to leave children behind when you are deported will depend on who you have, if you have or not support or family networks to actually leave the children with others, right? So it will actually interact with gender and family structure in the United States. And you can think that if you are a single parent and you are deported, you have no one else to leave the children with, although we're actually seeing as well in a different paper, kind of like an increase of foster child and leaving US-born children with other family members, but we were not, focused on that in this paper, okay? Now, we know that migrant mothers are more likely than migrant fathers to live with these children. And so we, as I said, we think that we will see differences. Something else that is interesting is that, oops, I forgot that we do see, well, as I said, we do see an increase of children in foster care or guardians taking care of these children more recently, okay? So this relates to our third question on whether or not this family process of de facto deportation is gendered. We want to see if there are women overrepresented among the deported parents with the US-born children, and also how does parental structure of the de facto deported children vary when the father is deported or when the mother is deported, right? And so we look at the presence and or absence of and the migration status of the partner of the deported parent. Now, I want to say just before I go on that this paper, we are really interested in the de facto US-born children. But of course, there are de facto spouses, deported spouses, right? And this is something that we're looking at a different paper. And there are also de facto deported Mexican children, but for different reasons. We actually decided to focus on the US-born. Now, we use the ENADID, which is the Mexican National Survey of Demographic Dynamics. I really invite you all to actually, if you're interested on looking at ENADID, we used the 2014 and 2018 data. We're gonna have new data that will be collected next year and should be available before the Mexican 2025 mid-decennial census. So it will be definitely an interesting data source to use. There are some limitations, of course, but we identified migration in terms of place of birth and recent migration, basically the place of residence 5 years prior. What's interesting is that, so the 2020 census data has reason for migration, but way before we had this question available at the census, we had an ENADID including this cause of migration, of cause of return, right? And in the case of the census, we have cause of internal migration, immigration, and return as well. And so we identified those who were deported using the cause of migration question. And we defined the household relationships using the relationship to the household head. So one of the limitations of the ENADID data compared to the census data is that the census data identifies fathers, mothers, the latest children born alive, and partners, whereas ENADID only kind of like bases all the relationships to the head. So this is definitely a limitation that we try to overcome and that reviewers were actually very interested in us explaining. So we basically define a de facto deported US-born child as someone who was born in the United States, is under age 18, is the child of a parent in the household who is a recent migrant as well, whose reason was deportation, whose reason for return was deportation. But we also limited this to the child being a recent migrant himself or being under age 5, okay? And so, I mean, one thing to note is that we do not observe the exact timing of migration within this 5-year period, okay? We assume that the children who migrated over the same 5-year period as the parents, if they reside in the same household, okay? And we assume that they were accompanying their parents, okay? But of course, I mean, we don't know who returned first, right? They just migrated within this 5-year period. And it's also really hard to actually we do not observe, because we're using the 2014 data, we know that they were living in the United States in 2009, but it's impossible to actually observe migration or deportation before. And we know that we were talking about 2008 as being this peak, right? But there were deportations before, but it's not possible to actually study this prior period. it's really hard to identify parent-child relations in very complex households, which actually we know that migrants are more likely to live in extended complex households, to double up and to live with others. So this will be a limitation of the fact that we do not have the identifiers of the parents. And of course, we do not observe parents who do not live in the same household as the children. So as the children age into adulthood and they start their own households, we will not have the information, even if they might have been arriving to Mexico as joining other people who were deported. And this is actually very interesting to actually find de facto deportees' mothers who we see in our fieldwork, who are joining deported children, okay? Adults, but the children that might have never been in Mexico. We can also suspect that deportation is underreported in the census, right? So for these reasons, we take the step of applying the observed rate of de facto deportation among recent migrants to the entire population of the US-born children, and I'll explain that. Now, when we look at the count and gender of the deported migrants, we see that in this period, there were about 1,400,000 deportations to Mexico in the years. And in the United States admin data, we see that 93% of the Mexicans deported to Mexico were male. In the Mexican repatriados data, we see that about 90%. It was about 90%. And deportation is only about 14% of the recent migrants who actually said they were deported within this period. And we estimate this population to be around 106,000 for the returnees, right? And 90% are men. So when we compare that, using the ENADID and the shares of kind of like other estimates of the others who were deported, we see kind of similar shares of men, for example. But one of the first things to note is that, as I was saying, that returnees arrive to Mexico for many different reasons, and deportation is not this main reason for migration. I'm not going to go into too much detail because this is in the paper, but what we tried to do was to relate the US-born children, who are recent migrants, whose parents are also recent migrants, those who said that at least one parent returned to Mexico because he or she was deported. We estimated this rate of de facto deportation, and we estimated it to be about 17 in 2014 and 14 in 2018. Okay. Something to note is a very small sample size that makes our estimates from the ENADID like a little bit complicated. And in the paper we discuss what this means. We didn't focus on the 2018 data when comparing the conditions of these migrants. We didn't focus on that sample because we really think it's too small. But what's interesting is that, if we try to think how this share or this rate of de facto deported who migrated, and we actually compare it to what kind of like the deportation trends that we were seeing before and the return migration trends that we were seeing during this period, there was definitely a decline over time, and so we would expect that at least in the trend, it is credible. Now something else that we wanted to do was to understand what is the share of children of deported Mexican immigrant parents in the US that actually emigrate or are de facto deported. And so we did a very quick estimate using the DHS reports. So as I said, there were about 200,000 people deported that claimed a US-born child. And if we assume 70% are Mexicans, and we assume an average of 2 US-born children per deported parent, our estimate would be around 280,000 children. But we think that they need to migrate to Mexico and remain in Mexico, kind of like reconciling some of the estimates of 2008. We estimate about a share of about 3%. So suggesting that actually the large majority of families that face a parental deportation, they either reunite in the US or remain separated, okay? And so you might think that, well, this is a very small share, and why are we interested in the de facto deported US-born citizen children if if this is such a small population in some ways, right? Although we, as I said, we estimated this to be about, let's say, 100,000, which might not be negligible. But what's really interesting for us, at least, is to try to understand the conditions that these de facto deported US-born children live in Mexico, and how they're living. And when we compare kind of like very broadly the conditions and trying to address our second research question, which is like, how do they compare the to US-born children that arrived for different reasons, is that we actually see that overall they're living in worse conditions, right? So we show here the de facto deported US-born children who are recent migrants who migrated for other reasons, and those Mexican-born populations that are not migrants as a baseline. We conducted tests of two group differences. We only show in bold the results that where the de facto deported children are different from the US-born children for other reasons. And we can see two things. Different access to health insurance, and I'll go back to that. But also kind of like issues attending school, especially among those who are 6 to 12 years old in primary school. And there's a lot of research that has documented difficulty in accessing education and the kind of like bureaucratic challenges to enter schools. And we also see this difference between, in precarity of housing materials. I'm not going to go too much into detail in this because I really want to focus on my last minutes on two other things. One is that there are these gender processes, okay? And when we think about this third research question, we do see that, so here's the percent of the group that is women. And so among recent not deported migrants, we have about 26% women. So we still see kind of like a male domination in the Mexico-US migration stream. In the second column, we limit this to the sample of recent migrant parents who were not deported. And here we see that actually women is a majority. So women are more likely than men to be returned migrants with children in Mexico. And the share of women in the population of migrant parents is about twice that of the general population of migrants, right? And in the third bar, we limit to deported migrants. So still, as I said, deportees are mostly men. And among recent deported migrant parents, women are more than a quarter. And this representation of the population of deported parents is 3 times greater than the representation in the general population of deported migrants. So basically what this says is that among deported migrants, the share of women is 3 times larger among parents than among kind of like all deported parents. But what this is really saying is that when we kind of like join these results with the parental structure, and we just kind of like focus on the US-born children by gender and reason of return.
Claudia.
Yes.
It's Michelle. I just want to let you know you have about 5 minutes.
Yeah, I know. So we see that when the partner is present in the household and is not a migrant, when the parent is present in the household and is a migrant who was not deported, when the partner was present in the household and was deported, and when there is no partner in the household, kind of like signaling differences in how nuclear family migration occurs versus de facto migration of the spouses as well. And we see that for fathers who were not deported, the vast majority co-reside with a partner who was not deported. the partner for migrant mothers is very different. So migrant mothers are far more likely than the migrant fathers to be single parents. So, but at the same time, when the fathers are deported, you will see that the partner is also present, right? And when the mothers are deported and they reunite with children, they do so alone or with a deported partner. And this is interesting when we actually try to think about the family structures. Just to wrap up, yes, we estimated about 80,000 to 100,000 de facto deportees. About 70% of the US-born children in Mexico were there due to de facto deportation. Child immigration from the US appears to be an uncommon response to parental deportation. They are less likely to be enrolled in primary school, less likely to have health insurance, and to live in more precarious housing conditions. When we compare to US-born arriving for other reasons, there is a gendered pattern of de facto deportation. So as I said, women are overrepresented among deported parents with US-born children. But then again, kind of like the structure matters, parental structure matters. So father migration with children is kind of like nuclear family migration, meaning that mothers migrate too. But when mothers are deported and migrate with the children, it is actually single parent migration that's happening because the fathers are absent, and they're actually, I mean, in many cases, still in the United States, right? Now, but going back to Leti, very, very quickly, just to wrap up. Kind of like, I mean, we would have not counted Leti in the Enadict. Okay, they migrated before 2009. Actually, after arrival, they separated. So Alonso, who was kind of like facing deportation procedures, was not in the household. So we would have not identified his deportation, the de facto deportation of the children, right? And it's not uncommon to have separation after deportation. Okay, they long the fact that they were born in the United States, but they don't know English. The kids, right? They didn't go to school. I mean, it gets more complicated because of other conditions that they're facing. Letty's having trouble finding jobs. Alonso as well. And what's interesting is that, I mean, they actually were born in California, and the children really long to going back to meeting where they were born, but this is impossible, right? This, at least for now, for them to do. If they're 21, it will be kind of unclear, right? Now, if families do not reunite in Mexico, they could reunite in the United States, and we're doing some work with the MIF data to actually look at intentions to reunify. It's kind of unclear how to compare or how to use Mexican data with the US data to actually kind of like see if this emigration actually selected on particularly disadvantaged families. So that's something that we're also doing. And kind of like just finish is that it's really hard to think what should be done, right, with de facto deportation. So we could think how it would be important to allow for the cancellation of removal in deportation cases if they're parents of US-born citizen children, or to waive bars on re-entry for parents of US citizen children. But I mean, immigration discussions do not seem to be on that direction. Now, I really want to think that it is a family affair, and US immigration policy will have impacts on families regardless of where they live. So we do see lots of family separation. Even if I focus today on de facto deportation, the truth is that many are separated, and they're living binational family lives. And I can go into that detail in the questions if you want, but let me finish with that. I'll just leave very quickly. I didn't go to this, but just before my last slide, many of the US-born children actually have Mexican nationality, right? And they have the right to apply for Mexican nationality because most of them have at least one Mexican parent. And in a different piece on a book called The Mexican Dream, focusing on US-born in Mexico, we actually see that access to Mexican nationality is increasingly, it has increased over time. There's an increase of adults that obtain Mexican nationality while being in Mexico. Some of them are actually these de facto deported spouses that are Mexican Americans. But the law allows for the US born having Mexican grandparents to actually apply for Mexican nationality. Now, Mexico has 750,000 US born. About 2/3 of them have Mexican nationality as well. 500,000 are children, but it's really unclear how this dual nationality will actually pose different questions on citizenship and immigration in the future. And I really want to finish with that idea that it will be a family affair in the future as well. And it is on the best interest of, let's say, the US society to actually look for the well-being of the US born, regardless of place of birth, right? Regardless if they're in Mexico or if they decide to go back to their country in the future. So let me stop with that. Yes.
Great, we have a few minutes for questions. Celeste?
No, there's online. There's
Okay.
No, there's no question, but I actually have a question for Claudia. I was wondering if you could say something a little bit to state variation in the US of policies and how that might have affected some specific children more than others, or if there is anything done on that aspect. So that's from the US part. And then maybe, now that I'm saying it, maybe if there's something that in the Mexican, so regional variations in Mexico that could have also affected children being received in more states than others.
Yes. So unfortunately, we don't know where they were coming from in the US. There's no way to know. And there's also, as you said, there's state variation on immigration law. There's also state variation on mixed status families within the United States, different states. So we haven't really looked at that. We hope that when we combine the US and Mexican census data that we might find, but we might be able to actually see these differences, but not so far. What we do know is these state differences in Mexico, and in that sense, let me go back to share my screen, but very, very quickly, just to show something. So we know that Mexico, why is it not working? Okay, there you go. So in 2021, I published the Atlas of Return Migration, actually looking at kind of like state differences. And there are US-born migrants everywhere in the US, but there's also a concentration in border states. There's some discussion on whether or not these people who are in the North go through, I don't know, like birth tourism or have kind of like metropolitan binational life within, let's say, San Diego and Tijuana, and therefore give birth. But there are US born in every municipality in Mexico, right? There's some concentration in these traditional sending states of the the middle western Mexico, so Jalisco, Michoacan, Guanajuato, that is related to also an increase of return, but it's not unique, right? And there's actually very interesting differences. I don't think I have this slide here, but when there's actually studies, for example, looking at the US-born youth that speak Maya languages that are living in Quintana Roo, whose parents are originally from Yucatan. There's also other studies from other areas looking at these US-born and having trouble kind of like integrating, depending on whether they arrive to a rural area, to an indigenous community, to a big city, to a metropolitan area, and the challenges of how they are perceived or discriminated according to their kind of like way of, their dress code and how they speak English is very different within Mexico and US. Within Mexico, right? And something that I did in the Atlas was to actually kind of like summarize what we know for each state, for the return migrant population in the state, but also for the US born. And there are many pending issues. So I described kind of like the reality of the state, and I then described the pending issues according to this reality in the face of all the literature that has been accumulated on the topic for that specific state. And you see huge variations, right? Because Mexico is a very, Mexico is a very unequal, diverse country. And so the economy is diverse, is defined by very regional differences. So overall, you see that the North is richer than the South. But even within the South, there are very important differences. So of course, these processes will vary a lot, and it will depend a lot of the local context of reception. And in that sense, there's a lot of qualitative studies that actually highlight what happens within these small communities that are receiving returnees and the US born. But there's still kind of like what we're missing is kind of like within quantitative studies show the actual effect of this local context. And so we know that it varies by state, but we also know that it really varies a lot by type of community and population size, and even the opportunities that these places will have, right?
Okay, Magali.
Thank you. Thank you, Claudia. That was very interesting. This is not my field, but I learned a lot.
Thank you, Magali.
And my question was relative to some issue you raised at the very end, and that has to do with the table you showed about the situation, the socio-economic situation of where you compare children born from deported migrants and the US born from other migrants, and then Mexican children. And as you mentioned, I would have thought that the migrants returning from other reasons than deportation would have very different characteristics before migration than the people who got deported. And you said you can't capture that in the survey you're analyzing, but you might have access to other data. But there must be some, you might be able to speculate on that. Can you tell us more?
Sure. So, well, two things. The retrospective data that we have available in Mexico is, the sample size of the returnees is really small, so it's actually very hard to do. So we have the retrospective, the retrospective demographic data that is great for demographic processes, but not for return. What's important is that when we compare these characteristics broadly, we do see that the children of deportees are actually faring worse. But in general, we see that the foreign-born population in Mexico is actually faring better in other conditions. So if you see, for example, in earnings, and there's a different paper that I wrote with Nicole Denier, published at PRPR in 2020, showing that kind of like looking at economic integration over time, the earnings of the returnees, but also the US born, and it's interesting that we actually included the US born because we were interested in what happens when they enter the labor market, right? And so we were focusing a lot in education, but they also age and they enter the labor market. These conditions were actually deteriorating, and they were earning as bad or as low as Mexicans without migration experience, right? And just to say that it is important to consider that Mexico has still kind of like low salaries and informal jobs. And so they arrive to these labor markets and they incorporate like that. So when we compare even the housing conditions or, for example, access to healthcare, because access to healthcare in Mexico is linked to employment, then if the parents are not finding jobs, right? If Alonso and Leti are not finding jobs, then the children will grow up in these households that have this economic adversity. But it is complicated to actually see the whole span. Now, in 2020 census data, the sample size is larger, and we have all these reasons for migration. And in an unpublished work that hopefully will be published soon, we actually see that deportees, the adults are not doing worse than those that return for other reasons. And something that we're trying to explain is that actually part of the answer comes from the fact that most deportees are not bringing their children. So they're alone in Mexico and they actually need to find a job. And for those that actually are coming with the children, they are also kind of like in need of finding a job. And they somehow mobilize different resources. But what we're actually seeing is that those that return for economic reasons, economic hardship, for example, or for health problems, or wanting to retire, or at older ages without the intention to retire, are actually having lots of trouble. Right? But these elderly might not be, well, older because they're not really elderly, but these older returnees might not have these US-born children. So in a sense, that's why we are not observing those without children that are actually also having lots of hardship, right? But that's a different paper, right? Now, in a sense, we do think that, and this is coming from the qualitative work, that those who are deported definitely face lots of mental health issues, lots of health issues as well, substance abuse, and other kind of like conditions due to the fact that they went through sometimes long periods in prison or detention, and that they were isolated kind of like forcibly from their families. And this is worse for those who are older adults. We have a case in our fieldwork, a returnee that arrived to the US when he was 3 years old. He was deported when he was 53. So he lived 50 years in the US and he didn't know Mexico. And for him, it was super hard. And all of his children and grandchildren are in the US, right? So what we're actually seeing in that sense is that there's a lot of family separation because deportation or forced return actually, I mean, if they're older, their children will be older. And so there's no need to bring the children with them, right? So just to think that when we look at the de facto deported children and the minors, then there's also lots of Mexicans that have adult children that will be able to stay alone and for whom this de facto deportation question might have no really sense, right?
Okay, we are out of time, but thank you so much, Claudia. Let's give her another round of applause.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone. And let me know and contact me if you have any question. I know that there is a question from Adriana. Oh yes. I mean, I can stay and answer Adriana's question if you want.
I can also email you.
You can email me. So Mexican-born children are also